Hey everyone, welcome back to the Psychology of Business podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brandon Griffin, and joining me on my virtual studio today is Christine Fisher. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Brandon.
Well, thanks for joining me. So it's the end of the year, it's the end of the semester. I'm doing a lot of grading. I'm doing a lot of wrapping up classes, and something that naturally comes up is the topic of burnout. I have a young family at home. I'm a, young tenure track professor. There's a lot on my plate. I can oftentimes feel burned out. I can feel overwhelmed. And Christine, she's going to talk to us today about burnout, what it is, kind of through a couple different lenses, social psychology, through organizational behavior lens. But before we do that, before we talk about burnout, I would give you a chance to introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what your background is, and how you got interested in studying and teaching this topic.
Okay, thank you so much, Brandon. I really appreciate the opportunity. And rest assured, you are not alone in those sentiments related to burnout. So a little bit about me. I'm a lecturer at the University of Michigan-Dearborn in management studies, teaching managerial communication and organizational behavior. I also am a Ph.D. student in leadership at Anderson University in South Carolina, and I am currently working on research around transformative leadership, symbolic leadership language, and organizational change in higher education. But some of the other interests of mine have revolved around concerns related to stress and its effect on job performance and organizational commitment. So that stems from the teaching that I do in organizational behavior. But along with that, I was in a social psychology course in my leadership program, and I ended up focusing on this subcategory of stress, which is burnout. And so hence our time together today.
So I think everyone has a general idea of what burnout is. It gets to the point where you're overwhelmed, where, it just seems like there's too much on your plate. But I'm sure and I've seen some of the literature, it's broad, it's wide, it's varied, it exists in different circumstances. But I think that's all something we can relate to. I remember during my PhD program, when I finished my comprehensive exams, I just felt like I had to take like a month off or a couple of weeks off, where I just felt like I just had to lay on the floor and do nothing. I was just so burnt out. Or there's, kind of the burnout in your day-to-day life where you get home at night and you just, need to just almost shut down just so you have enough energy to go the next day. But, it's kind of a bad thing. We don't want people to be in burnout. So I think everyone has kind of this fundamental surface level view of what burnout is, but could you tell us a little bit more about the academic research and what burnout actually is?
Yes, absolutely. So the World Health Organization actually has defined what burnout is, and they talk about it as sort of three categories. One is emotional exhaustion. So this is that feeling that you're expressing, this idea of energy depletion or literally exhaustion. And then there's also some other components related to work and the job or the work that you're doing. And that would be this idea of depersonalization. So this stems from creating sort of this mental distance from your job or the work that you're doing. It can evolve to feelings of negativism and even cynicism related to one's job. And then the third one is this reduced sense of personal accomplishment. So you may be working, let's say you're a nurse in the healthcare arena, this would be right for burnout. And you love your work, you love taking care of your patients. But then COVID-19 happens and you are working 24 hours and you end up reaching to this point of burnout where you no longer feel that strong sense of personal accomplishment. You just need some time away from that to perhaps fall back in love with your job. So those three elements are what the World Health Organization has defined as burnout. And then there most certainly is a great deal of research in the academic literature as well as in the popular press as well around burnout.
So you said burnout's three things. It's kind of this emotional exhaustion. It's kind of having a negative or a cynical view of what you're doing. And then also what was the last one? It was you're not feeling a sense of accomplishment, right?
Yeah, like a reduced professional efficacy. So a lack of or a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. So you're
Hmm.
no longer really feeling good about what it is that you're doing. You may have in the past felt positive feelings towards the work that you're doing, but now it's evolved to the point where it's like this reduced efficacy, professional efficacy that they called it.
So I study psychological meaningfulness, and that almost seems like the exact opposite. With psychological meaningfulness, it's kind of something that you put your energy into, you start to identify it. It's almost like you draw yourself closer. So that's almost the exact opposite, where you distance yourself instead of it bringing, stuff out, instead of filling you with life, it's kind of taking resources out of you to the point where you have nothing left. So in your course and in your studies now, how are you exploring burnout? What are you, how are
Yeah.
you working with burnout now?
So it's actually very important to recognize that this is not just an individual concern. There's actually sort of three layers that the research has focused on. One certainly is the individual level. Okay, so there are personal characteristics that predispose someone to burnout more so than another individual. So, for example, if you are a perfectionist or you lack emotional self-regulation skills, you would be more susceptible to burnout. Also, there are some traits that often struggle with managing workload effectively, which will lead to higher stress levels in an individual and then eventually burnout. But there's also the team and the organization level that needs to be addressed. So it's not like this issue of burnout is something that just an individual needs to manage. It's actually, you're not an individual in an organization by yourself, you're in an organization, right? And so at the team level, what could contribute to burnout is certainly dysfunctional dynamic, of course, poor communication, classic, right? And a lack of support. All those things can, in the research they've shown, exacerbate stress and lead to burnout. So we talk about like a toxic work environment, for example. That would be fertile ground for potential burnout as well. And so what happens is employees feel isolated and they just don't feel supported. So that would be at the team level. And then at the organization level, what happens is there may be high job demands or a lack of role clarity. So that is at the organizational level, how the organization is structured, for example. Also, inadequate rewards, where people do not feel like they are being treated fairly or being rewarded for their efforts fairly. And then just generally speaking, insufficient organizational support. So perhaps, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit to the strategies, but perhaps there are no wellness programs at your organization. There's a lot of things that can be done at the organizational level. So the individual, the team, and the organization are all fertile ground for for burnout to fester. And so there's definitely issues around higher rates of turnover and reduced productivity as it relates to this issue of burnout.
That makes a lot of sense because when people think of burnout, I think most people, at least I think of the individual level, but it makes sense that burnout can occur in teams as well as organizations as a whole. As you were talking, something that came to my mind is I could see maybe if there have been massive layoffs at an organization, and that could impact the level of burnout with all the employees, because maybe you have enough people and you feel like you're able to do your job, but if you lose half your team and you have to pick up that slack and maybe resources are cut, maybe the wellness programs are reduced, naturally I think that's going to lead to more burnout. So even though it may help financially, maybe culture wise or with the morale, it's not going to be as effective. So you mentioned some of the strategies that you can do to help with burnout. What are some of those? What's kind of the next steps? Because obviously this is something we don't want, to be, because you're going to have more turnover. You're going to have reduced performance. So what are some of the strategies employers or individuals can use to help their teams and organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So because this is not just an individual issue, I'll kind of start with sort of, in the workplace, what can be done. And of course, managing the workload is critical, right? So team leaders need to check in with team members to make sure that their workloads are manageable, that if they are struggling, then they need to provide support. So, training leaders, managers, supervisors around, emotional intelligence, being aware of their own emotions, but also taking account for the emotions of others. So sort of that leadership training, leadership development piece. But actually, so some organizations, back to this idea of managing the workload, some organizations may have no meetings on Fridays, or they may take Friday afternoons off in the summer. So there are some very basic strategies that organizations can employ to manage the workload, right? There's also issues around fairness and transparency. So making sure that the reward systems are being employed fairly, and that employees are being rewarded for the work that they do. Sometimes employees are doing yeoman's work, right? And their supervisor, for some reason, is not aware of that level of activity. And so that's managing the workload. But then they're not getting compensated or rewarded or recognized for this yeoman's work that they're doing. So now we have a double, concern there, right? The workload and the issue around reward, or being transparent about what's happening, and giving recognition for the work that is being done. The organizations may want to employ something like a resilience program, which would entail things like mindfulness training, stress management training, and again, training the leaders in the organization around, emotional intelligence, like I mentioned before. We think that if we address employees' well-being sort of preventively, that will mitigate the amount of burnout that can happen. Gallup actually has done a bunch of surveying and writing about burnout. And in the data, it shows that about 76% of employees have expressed some level of burnout at some point in time. And so it's really a big issue. And I think the organizations that do employ organizational behavior management best practices are the ones that are obviously going to be able to mitigate this occurring. Mm-hmm. But in order to do that, they need to employ wellness types of programs, really at the individual level, and then even at the team level.
And you've probably heard this. What's the saying? It's an ounce of prevention's worth more than a pound of cure. Is that the saying?
100%. And so there are some inventories that are available, burnout inventories, assessments that can be used by organization. But and so that's diagnostic and that's helpful. But there's actually some information in the literature around taking a more holistic approach, where, like you said, the prevention is very important. So there is the idea around prevention, but then there's also obviously intervention. So we can do what we can around prevention, but then we do have our individuals who are going to be predisposed to burnout, and so then you need to have intervention programs as well. So maybe employee assistance programs obviously are a good example of that. Taking vacation, and making sure that your employees are taking their vacation time. And then, if it's very serious, then there might need to be, other supports, because really what happens with burnout, with stress, which leads to burnout, is we could end up having some mental health problems, also some physical problems do manifest from that level of stress. So it could be, TMJ, it could be heart, issues, and, it could really be quite serious. So prevention, intervention, and then sort of ongoing maintenance. So a great example of an organization who I believe has these components in works would be Google. So we're all pretty familiar with the company Google. They have things like nap pods and generous vacation leave time and so on. And other wellness programs at their, in particular at their corporate office and perhaps at the other offices throughout the country. So they're a well-known example of a company, of an organization that has put into place intervention or strategies that would help with intervention and maintenance, ongoing maintenance. Another company is not as well known. It's called Buffer. It's a software company, and they've employed a 4-day work week, and they have found an increase in productivity and a decrease in burnout. So there's a lot of different, ways that organizations can proactively deal with this idea of burnout. But just like many things that, are sort of the negative outcome of a particular issue, it's inevitable. It's sort of part of life. But how can we manage it more effectively and then reduce the levels in the organization by looking at the individual, looking at the team, and then also, organizationally, what can we do?
So one thing I thought was really interesting as you were talking is kind of the physical side effects or the physical symptoms that can occur because of this psychological phenomenon. So oftentimes in management, specifically if we talk about maybe social psychology or organizational behavior, everyone kind of people can tease. It's like, oh, you're talking about feelings, you're talking about, emotions. It's like let's go back to the hard, dollars and cents. But when we actually come and think about the outcomes of some of these psychological processes like burnout, it can have real results. It can lead to, when you're burnt out, you can be exhausted, you can have disconnected from work, but that can lead to, self-isolation. You can have physical symptoms. If you have high stress levels, that may even have damaging effects, some cardiovascular issues. There can be real issues that can exist from being in an environment that is so negative like that. But as you were finishing up your thoughts, you said that this is something that is inevitable. And it seems like, especially since the pandemic, people have been more and more aware of burnout. Do you think this has always existed, or do you think it's more of a modern phenomenon, or is it just that we're talking about it more?
I don't know the exact details of the data, but my sense from the literature is that post-pandemic, or because of the pandemic, what has happened is the boundaries of work and personal life have been blurred. And so even though you might think, okay, we have more hybrid work, people can work from home, et cetera, what has ended up happening is the lines have then been blurred. So when do you stop working? If you're working from home, do you have a young family who needs you and you don't have enough childcare support? So I do think there is a greater fertile ground for burnout. We may be talking about it more because it is more of a problem, right? And certainly the costs, like you alluded to, the physical costs are there, but there's also a cost to the organization. There's been, we can have an increase in absenteeism. We can have even what they call an increase in presenteeism, which is basically employees who show up for work but are not engaged. And so we do know that our organizational behavior management practices do have an alignment with the financial performance, the organizational performance. So we can look at this issue of burnout as being a cost to individuals, and certainly we may be talking about it more, but I do think it's probably because it is happening. And like the most recent research actually from Gallup does show, about 76% or so of employees are expressing some level of burnout at some point in time. So I just don't know the difference from pre-pandemic. But nonetheless, we also can see that there is a higher degree of job dissatisfaction when employees are burnt out. So we have, absenteeism, we have job dissatisfaction, and we've got this idea of presenteeism. And so there's a great cost to the organization if they're not providing some preventative measures around employee well-being to manage stress, which of course leads to this burnout. Like you mentioned before, the cost to the individual, that has an effect on their job performance, right? If you are suffering from insomnia, which can be a result of burnout, then you're not going to be as alert at your work and so on. So it has a great deal of cost to it that we need to think about, just like almost any other health concern. How can we prevent this from happening, knowing that we will have a certain percentage of folks who are going to get burnout, and so then what interventions can we provide to them? Now, the real sad story is that if an organization is not equipped with these strategies, then they are going to, um, employees are going to continue to suffer. And then consequently, the organization will suffer. Because at the end of the day, we need human beings who are flourishing in organizations in order to have flourishing organizations.
I think that's a great point. One thing that might be difficult, I think, from a like macro level, I think all organizations should implement these well-being policies and do all they can to avoid burnout, to help employees be more engaged, to feel like they can show up to work and, enjoy their jobs. But if I'm someone who works for an organization that has hundreds or even thousands of employees and I can't make those changes, is there anything I can do individually or to help the people around me with the burnout? Because from a kind of theoretical level, I think it'd be great to implement these tools. Well, what's something someone could do today to help burnout, either with their teams or their coworkers or even themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do think an individual needs to give themselves permission to take a time out. They need to check, do I have the ability to take some PTO, some paid time off? Even if it's not paid, if I give myself permission to take a time out? And then that may mean just being disengaged from work. So not going into the office, not getting online, just disengaged from work. Certainly mindfulness training, if you can pick up a book or a podcast or an audio version of a book, whatever is easy to access, to gain some strategies around mindfulness and that emotional regulation that is a factor in leading to burnout. So individuals who are more perfectionistic or are not as skilled at emotional regulation, those are the ones that are most susceptible for burnout. So if you do think that those are some traits that you or characteristics that are inside of you, then you need some tools. So number one, try to take some time away from your work. And of course, gaining some mindfulness training, one strategy, stress management techniques, obviously, going for a walk, listening to music, meditating, you're a faith-filled person, prayer, all of those strategies are something that are very accessible and that you can do right away. I think the biggest thing that individuals need to do is they need to give themselves permission to take that time out. Have they taken their vacation time? Have they planned for some, fun activities recently? Are they just going hard on the work and are very one-dimensional? We're not one-dimensional people. We need different outlets for to express who we are. And if we're only expressing ourselves through our work, that is going to lead to burnout more than likely.
And as we're talking, it kind of occurred to me that there are really two things you can do to help stave off burnout. It's like the first one is you work hard at your job, and when you get burnt out, let's just take time off, let's recharge those batteries, and then let's do the same thing. Let's work for a couple months, get burnt out, take a couple days off, let's recharge. So that's kind of that's you taking your time off to recover. But there's also things that you should do day to day, because hopefully we won't get to a point where we're just so burnt out where our batteries are at zero that we're forced to take time off. We talk about taking PTO, but if you're so burnt out, so stressed, you're going to get sick. You're going to, you may not be able to enjoy that time. So there are things that you can do, to recover, but it also seems like there are things that you should be able to do day to day to help stave off that burnout. So as you were talking, that's something that occurred to me, and I actually have personal experience with this. So a couple of years ago, on New Year's, I decided to come up with a New Year's motto instead of a resolution, instead of something like that. I decided to come up with a motto, and my motto was be deliberate. And kind of the idea is I was finishing up a really heavy couple years of school, and I was taking a lot of credit hours. I was working. It was really busy for me. And I got to the point where I felt guilty taking time off. So it's kind of this idea you're talking about of giving yourself permission. I felt guilty taking time off. If I wanted to not work, or if I didn't want to do school, if I wanted to watch a show, or if I wanted to go visit friends or family, I felt like I had to always be working. So my idea was to be deliberate, where if I'm going to watch a movie, I'm going to put everything to the side. I'm going to watch a movie so I can actually enjoy it instead of, half getting the benefits. Because I'm sure we've all tried to do something relaxing or fulfilling, something that recharges us. But in the back of our mind, we're still ruminating or thinking about the thing that we have to do. So my idea was, if I was just going to be more deliberate of, okay, if I have 2 hours to relax, let's relax. But if I have 2 hours to work, let's actually work and get things done. So I think what you're saying, in my personal experience, has helped with burnout and, keeping productive when you do have things to do.
That is such a valuable note, because I too actually can relate to that feeling of guilt, because you know intellectually, cognitively, that you ought to take a break. Like, you can't just keep going hard, whether it be with your work or if you're in school as a student. I mean, academics are very time sensitive. So in many ways, you must keep going. And you can't always take a break, because academic work, whether you're a teacher or a student, is very time sensitive. So that when you do take a break, when you do give yourself that permission, I can relate to that idea. And I think feeling guilty, I think we need to put that aside and put it in its proper place. And just to say that in order for me to continue to perform at a high level, I need to be able to give myself permission without guilt to continue, or to go ahead and do some of these wellness activities. I would say, besides giving yourself permission to take a time out, we need support, right? And we talked a little bit about some of those strategies, but at a very basic level, on your team, with your manager, if you're in an individual contributor role, or if you are a manager, certainly reaching out to those around you for support, building those relationships in the workplace are incredibly important. You do need, your personal support system of your family and friends, but in the workplace, if we don't have a support system in our workplace, then that is also going to be a factor that works towards a fertile ground for burnout. So being able to share with others on your team or in your workplace and have some meaningful conversation, maybe about the work that you're doing, so that you can have that release, that emotional release about what may be, percolating, is very important as well.
So something that we talked about off camera that I want to bring up now, you said you just finished your oral exams. You finished your comprehensive exams a couple months ago. So me and Christine met at the Midwest Academy of Management in October, and I reached out to her and I said, hey, I'd love to have you on the podcast. Let's talk. She said, oh, I'm busy right now. And I didn't realize how busy you were. You're, at your comprehensive exam stage. You shouldn't have even emailed me back. You should have just, done what you're doing. You're presenting at this conference and going to other conferences. But I joked, and you said you were not burnt out after all that. So how did you do that? So maybe turning the lens on you, how did you do all this stuff, and you still have time to come on a podcast like this?
Well, thank you for that. I think what I did, as the fall approached, I had certain goals that I wanted to accomplish. So I am teaching 4 classes. I'm working on my comprehensive essays. I was planning to attend a couple of conferences and present. I had done this all very, I guess in your words, deliberatively, right? So I framed my fall as it was going to be busy, and I wanted to accomplish these certain things. So I think by framing it as, yes, there's a lot, my fall is going to be very busy, and these are the things that I want to accomplish, that I gave myself permission maybe to not get burnt out. In other words, I prepared myself sort of ahead of time to say, I'm doing this. This is what I want to do. This is accomplishing my goals. And then once I'm done, I will be able to take a break, a little bit of a break.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think that's really insightful, kind of gearing up, knowing that you're going to have a hard time, and people can have the luxury where they can back off a little bit. So I'm glad that you survived the semester. Our semester, my in-person classes have their finals right now. My online classes end next week. So after next week, I can have some time off. So I'm glad you're able to, survive this busy semester, but congrats on all that.
Thank you. And I think it's important to do a reset, once you've been through a very busy time, whatever that may be in life, and to do a bit of a reset. I'll do a small reset because I'm still needing to work on the dissertation, and a new semester will begin for my teaching. But with that all said, I think that over time, if we can employ some of those individual strategies, as well as seek out support, whether it be from family, friends, or our coworkers, that can help mitigate the level of burnout or the tendency towards it. And hopefully, we can manage so that we rarely experience burnout. But if we see its ugly head rising, we have definitely some strategies to help ourselves cope, as well as maybe those around us.
Mm-hmm. Well, Christine, I'd like to thank you so much for talking to us all about burnout. It's great meeting you and talking with you and learning about what you're doing. I'm sure as you continue your PhD, continue your work, you can do great things.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. You have a great day and happy learning. We'll see you next time.